What Black Lives Matter protesters can learn from civil rights protests of the past. In 2020, protests broke out around the world following the death of George Floyd. Floyd was an unarmed black man killed by police in May 2020. Shahid Buttar is a Black Lives Matter activist. He has also been protesting in the streets for 20 years. Buttar knows protests can be dangerous. Situations can escalate, as seen in confrontations between demonstrators and police in 2020. But Buttar believes the new wave of protests bring positive social change. The United States has a long history of protests and uprisings. The Boston Tea Party was an early rebellion against British rule. That tradition of rebellious protest continues today. Large numbers of Americans have taken to the streets to speak out against police violence and institutional racism. Aaron Bryant works at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Bryant says protests draw attention to needs. Then, other people became part of the movement. Protests should not be expected to achieve anything on their own. Change comes from long-term organizing, voting in elections, and challenging cultural expectations. The civil rights movement protests that started in the 1950s led to major social changes. Protests were part of a large movement to fight for racial equality. Racial equality is the equal treatment of all people regardless of race. In 1955, Rosa Parks sparked protests after she refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. The protest lasted 1 year. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled against segregated public buses. In 1963, King gave his I Have a Dream speech to 250,000 people at the March on Washington. These efforts resulted in significant reforms. Examples of these reforms include the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Professor David Mayer compares successful protests to cracking a safe with multiple locks. He says, "It's not about getting one lock to open, it's opening multiple locks over time that ultimately leads to change." Today, activists have not lost hope and continue to fight on. Media has become an important part of building their movement. During the 1960s, civil rights activists used media to spread images of their movement. Images and messages reached televisions, magazines, and newspapers across the country. Professor Todd Boyd says this was an essential part of the nonviolent protests. Martin Luther King Jr. believed people might join the cause if they saw these images. Today, smartphones give almost everyone a camera in their pockets. It's made a difference, Boyd says. I've had a number of white people say that although they weren't familiar with this sort of police behavior personally, this all is obviously very wrong. The video of George Floyd's death spread quickly across the world. The video lets other Americans walk in the shoes of their fellow African American citizens, says Professor Omar Waswo. Omar Wasso studies protest movements. He says that protesters in the 1960s marched in southern cities where they met more resistance on purpose. They hoped television cameras would lead to national outcry. The media, Wasso says, has a large effect on what the public thinks. Activists say that today's protests feel different to the protests of the past. These protests are uniting people of all races. Together, the protesters are demanding changes across a range of issues, such as policing and economic inequality. Buttar says the protests are different because of the internet. It allows people to connect easily and spread the message of the movement. Patrisse Cullors is a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. She says streets will stay filled until change comes. People being in the streets reminds us of our power, she says. Often, we're not safe out there. Blacks are not safe jogging, not safe driving, not safe walking. So when we step into those streets, we're saying that we are taking our power back.